Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in Spanish and French literature. I feel like I've said this a bunch recently, which really speaks to the fact that I'm really deeply invested these days in literature that is written in Spanish. But today we are going to put this PhD to very good use. Today we are talking about Álvaro Enrigue's new book, Ahora me rindo y eso es todo. It was published in 2018, but recently came out in English to much fanfare. And right at the top here, I just wanted to say a quick thing in Spanish. Para mí, pues me siento muy cómoda hablando en español. Pero lo que pasa es que si quiero dar como todo un análisis de algún libro, pues eso me cuesta bastante. Lo iba a hacer hoy. Bueno, lo que iba a hacer era hacerlo de dos maneras, en inglés, también en español. Pero luego me di cuenta de que sería 8, 10 horas haciéndolo todo en español. Y les digo que me alegro tanto que haya tanta gente hispanohablante que están escuchando y pues hay varios comentarios que me dicen, por favor, que lo haga en español. Pero la verdad, y me encantaría. Pero yo creo que también hay subtítulos que se puede poner en YouTube. Y algún día yo creo que sí, que lo voy a hacer, porque me parece un desafío bien bonito, ¿no? Lo de cómo hacer el esfuerzo de grabarlo todo en español, pero hasta el momento pues casi, perdonen por favor los perritos, ¿no? Pero la verdad que tengo tanto que quiero leer y tanto que quiero pues analizar que lo de pasar pues 10 horas más en una lectura pues me parece pues algo casi imposible en este momento. The quick English recap simply being that I really have this desire to do these lectures about these books that are written in Spanish. I have this desire to do them both in English and Spanish. The fact is, I'm very comfortable speaking in Spanish, but I'm more comfortable speaking in English. And I love the idea of like the challenge of sitting down and doing these things in Spanish, really like dusting off my more scholastic Spanish. But then I'm looking at this idea of like, it would be easily 10 to 12 hours of work that I would have to put in addition to the English version. So it would be an extra 10 to 12 hours. And honestly, I'm like, I need to spend those hours just like reading more and analyzing other things. So apologies to anyone who is wanting to hear this in Spanish, but it really would take a lot of esfuerzo on my part and a lot of time. So apologies right at the top that this is in English. So anyone who's listened to the Fox Page for a while knows that I like to start with this question of like, why am I reading this book and why am I reading it now? This is a very easy one to answer. I loved You Dreamed of Empires so much. I also really loved Muerte Súbita, which is Enrigue's one of his older books. So when I heard that there was another book coming out, I was so excited. I did not realize when I very first heard about it that it was a book that had already been published in 2018 in Spanish. As soon as I realized this was kind of like mid-February, I was like, oh my God, wait, I can be reading this in Spanish now. I don't actually have to be waiting for the translation on March 3rd. So I dove right on in, and I was so taken by this book. I did have to special order it. It was one of these things that I ordered without having any idea what it was. And I must admit that when it arrived and I saw that it was about Geronimo, one of our most esteemed Apache warriors, part of me was like, oh no, wait, what? Because this is a period of time that doesn't naturally draw me. I should have stepped back a little bit and realized that like Muerte Súbita, sudden death, is about Caravaggio and Quevedo, which like that, you know, I think it's beginning of the 16th century. Like that is not a time period that really like drew me in. And frankly, the idea of first contact between Moctezuma and Cortés, like those were also not times that were like immediately drawing me in. So I should have had all the faith in the world. But honestly, what I was off-put by was the notion of the Western. We're going to get to this, but Enrique is someone who has always loved the idea of like the Western, both I think in terms of literature and also in terms of movies. I do not share that same idea about Westerns. When I was growing up, we had this joke in my family that like whenever, I think this was once we got to like VHS tapes and you could rent something, and my dad would always be like, I have a suggestion, how about we watch High Noon? And we would all like laugh like this was like the most hilarious thing ever, because it was just simply something that was not at all interesting to us as a family, at least not to the four of us children. And honestly, having just said that, the thing that is most remarkable is I found this book so engrossing. I mean, this is a book that I thought I would be skimming quite a bit, and I wasn't. I mean, we are going to get to a couple of parts where I felt like my attention flagging a tiny bit, but the real surprise was how like riveted I was. It is a long book. One of the reviews said something like, it's a long book that can feel longer. It does. There are times, I think, when we have like a little more information than maybe this reader and maybe that reviewer wanted. But for the most part, I found it incredibly engaging. And one of the aspects that I think really drew me in is, to a certain extent, this is kind of an experimental book. It's not like super formally inventive, but we do have this idea of all of these different strands being woven together. After I finished the book, I was listening to a couple of interviews with Enrigue that I will be referring to as we move through the lecture today. And in one of them early on, he was talking about this idea of the polyphonic novel. So the polyphonic novel is something that I have been familiar with. It's kind of it's one of the aspects of Latin American literature in the boom during the 60s and 70s that was really prominent. So you see this in Pedro Páramo, which was by Juan Rulfo in 1955. Very importantly, Enrique said that is the perfect novel, that Pedro Páramo is a perfect novel. And in that book, you do have all of these different voices. We also, polyphonic meaning like a lot of different voices, a lot of different sounds. So we also have it with Rayuela by Cortázar. That is a book that famously, it's hopscotch in English. It's a book that can be read in any order. You have many, many different voices that are happening there. We also have, in one of the interviews, Enrique was talking about the impact of Conversación en la Catedral. That is by Mario Vargas Llosa, who is the Peruvian writer. I recently did a lecture on Aunt Julia and the screenwriter, which I don't know why they call it screenwriter in English. That is just like such a weird thing to me, because he's not really writing, like it's not like he's writing screenplays in it. I like the Spanish title much more, which is La Tía Julia. I always want to say Tía Tula, La Tía Julia y el escribidor. But when I did that lecture, one of the comments that someone left on YouTube was like, this is the worst book that Mario Vargas Llosa wrote. And part of me, like, I don't really agree with that because I find the book so charming and I really, really love it. But I will absolutely agree that it is one of his most accessible and most kind of frothy and kind of lightest and most entertaining, for me, books. It's not one of his super like seriously heavyweight literary kind of achievement kind of things, and he has plenty of that. Conversación en la Catedral, which this is this polyphonic novel that for Enrique was very important. So all of these ideas of these different voices. And we're going to get to the structure soon, but I'll just go ahead and like front load this a little bit with the idea that one of the voices that we have running through the entire novel is the idea of a writer who is living in Harlem, who has biographical data that maps very closely onto Enrique's own from 2018, from before 2018 when he was married to Valeria Luiselli. I'm going to tell you right now, talk about polyphonic. This is a lecture that's going to be a little scattered. And I'm just going to tell you that right at the top because, in fact, the experience of reading the book really lends itself to this idea of having all of these tangents as we move through. The thing I will tell you about this lecture is that during the course of the lecture, it's very much like the course of any reader reading this book. One of the things I will be doing is helping you, hopefully, to kind of explore all of these different strands, all of these different voices that we're hearing, but I will also be trying to help you, braid them together a little bit and see the ways in which they both play off of each other, but that they also really support each other, and the way that the whole thing moves. I'm really into this metaphor, apparently, right here, this idea of things being tied together, because the whole thing does move in this way that you're sort of braiding these strands together. And in the end, it is beautifully kind of tied up. I will not say like with a bow, but it's a very satisfying experience. But also be aware right from the start that we are going to have some digressions. One of them is the idea of Valeria Luiselli. I read her Lost Children archive before I had read anything by Enrique. I loved that book so much. I read it during COVID. It was so profoundly hard to read, not in terms of challenging, but just in terms of emotionally, like it just kind of wrecked me. It is a book that I absolutely need to go back to. Luiselli is like so incredibly intelligent. Like that is a book that you could go back to again and again and again. She's playing with all these ideas of archives. Obviously, it's called the Lost Children Archive. Talk about polyphonic. I mean, it's an absolutely incredible piece of literature. And it's so interesting to actually think of the two of them in tandem because both of those people, both in Lost Children Archive and in Now I Surrender, both of those are talking about this road trip that is taken by a family. So when Enrique was talking about the idea of this through line of the family, fairly early on, we have the introduction of this first-person narrator. And that first-person narrator is also, someone who is on a road trip. And that storyline, I mean, there's some, like, in terms of the critical, take on this, I think some people found it more effective than others. I really liked it. I'm going to point out a couple of times when it didn't work quite as well for me, but I think it's crucial the way that it does run through it all. In the interview, Enrique was saying that it sort of feels like there are like 35 different novels in this novel. There's so much happening. I'm also just going to dive in here. I mean, again, we're going to really, we're going to dive in deep right at the beginning, and then we're going to pull back. We're going to do all sorts of different things during this lecture. So what I was going to say then is that with this first person narration and the idea of this person who is very much like Enrique, I think in many ways we are invited to conflate that first person narrator with the author. When we have that voice, he talked about the fact that it was really important to have someone in the contemporary moment for the reader to anchor to. And I agree with that. So this is a book that takes place in 1836. It begins then. And the Apache Wars were 1849. I was really going to just try to do that on my own. I was just going to like remember, and I am not going to be able to remember. I just had to look at my notes. The Apache Wars are 1849. Oh my God. And I literally looked at them and then I just totally forgot. I'm going to say 86. I'm going to take a look here and see if I am correct. Yes, correct. 1849 to 86. Technically, in Wikipedia, it says that they go all the way. There's some skirmishes, which seems like a very light word for what was actually happening then. But that goes all the way until 1909. But importantly, 1886 is significant in the book and in history because that is when Geronimo is surrendering himself. But so we have these moments, we have a lot of action that's taking place in 1836. Then we have that middle whole chunk that has to do with a lot of historical documents, a lot of different perspectives from, everyone from the president to all of these different, political figures to, soldiers who are involved in these so-called skirmishes. We have all of these different voices. But they're really, very firmly in the past. And I do believe that it was very important to have a voice that is anchored in the 21st century to kind of give us some context for what we were hearing, but also to kind of anchor us in the present moment. I was also taken by the fact that Enrique said it was very important for him to be wearing a Mexican shirt at the time. What he meant by that, of course, is that he is someone who's born in Mexico. He is a United States citizen. And there are a lot of important aspects of the book. It's not front and center, but there is this question of what it means for him to have become an American citizen. There are a lot of difficulties about kind of like bureaucratically what that means. But he is someone, and this is crucial, who is kind of between countries, someone whose nationhood is complicated by bureaucracy and by life and by the fact that he resides in the United States and yet was born in Mexico. He has a son who is in Mexico. He has other children in the United States. He is someone who is in between spaces, and what he is problematizing so beautifully by wearing his Mexican shirt is a very important point, and it is this, that when we think of the Apache Wars, which honestly, I had not thought of them, I don't even know that I knew like the term the Apache Wars. I certainly didn't know. I mean, for our purposes, I'm thinking of them as the last half of the 19th century. But what I did not understand, what we learned from Enrique is that for the Mexican population, people kind of like viewed this as like an American thing that was happening, when in fact there's a lot of involvement on the part of the Mexican Republic. Just recently, I was saying to someone that Geronimo, technically is a Mexican, or was a Mexican citizen, which is kind of a shocker for everyone. I think we don't think of him as having, and we think of him as being an Apache warrior, someone who's a citizen of Apacheria, and not so much as having, any other citizenship. This is obviously a book that, is very seriously problematizing the notion of, nationhood. Importantly, Enrique has said in the past that he doesn't really believe in, lines of nationhood, that when you cross a river, it doesn't make sense that you're moving from one nation into another nation, and that, for the most part, the people on either sides of a certain river feel and look all of the same ways. But these are the kinds of things that he is able to problematize because it's so easily, we as a reader can so easily relate to the idea of someone who is a father who's living in New York City who misses Mexico and misses being in his patria, his homeland, his motherland, and who also is conflicted because he has family in both of those places. He has a job in the United States. It's a very important anchoring in the present moment that then informs the way that we are looking at all of the different ways that this geographical location that had been occupied by the Apache peoples forever and ever and ever, literally millennia, I thought it was so interesting how they had come down like from Canada. As I'm saying that, I'm doubting myself, but I'm fairly, it was a group of people whose name began with an A, and they moved down into this area, an inhospitable area for them to be living in. Then you have, the Spanish Empire coming in, and then we have the Mexican Republic, forming and having its own ideas about who owns that land. And then we have the United States. I'm telling you stuff that you already know, but when you are thinking about all of that, you can understand the importance of having a contemporary voice that is anchoring us in the present moment in the 21st century. So as I just mentioned, this is going to be a bit of a messy lecture, and I do want to step back a little bit. I'm looking at my notes here, and I realize I do have a little more order than I'm starting off with. And one of them is like basically talking about the messiness of this novel, this note that I have here, and I am saying messiness in like with much affection. And I think it's interesting to see all of the different strands. One is the idea of like this capital H history. Not only do we see like actual source material, and this is stuff that's not like, I'm not sure we can say that it's absolutely correct, but you have the names of real people. We have transcribed telegraphs. We have certain people who are attached to certain dates. We have, President Cleveland. A lot of it does read like capital H history. We also have lower H history, which is like lowercase history, which in my mind is kind of like when we have someone who is a historical figure, but we're learning about either a smaller person in that person's orbit, someone who didn't quite make it into like the history book that you read in 10th grade. And certainly when we're seeing these things in scene, feels like historical fiction. But for some reason, I think because of the way he is dealing, and like a lot of that does feel historical. So we have this idea of history. We also have this idea of women. There are so many important women in this novel. At the very center of it, we have this idea of Camila, and she's someone who's really empowered in lots of ways. We're going to get to that because her abduction was so brutal. And I think that there are ways that you can really buy into the fact that she fell in love with mangas coloradas, but there are also ways that is highly problematic. So we're going to take a look at this. At a minimum, it's a very interesting look at the place of women within the Apache culture versus in the Mexican culture, or in the culture of the United States. We have that beautiful thing at the end. There's Ellie McMillan, I think that's her last name. We have women that are coming in at very important moments and playing really important roles in a way that I really enjoy. We, of course, have questions of national identity. I just was speaking to that. We have questions about narrative structure. It's separated into the three parts, which we're going to talk about, and each has a very different feel, and each is doing a very different thing. So even just in this different, like, textured way that we are actually reading, the way that the words are, like, appearing on the page, all of that feels complex, and again, falls into this idea of, like, the messiness of the novel. We have the idea, of course, of the Western. And again, I am not someone who's like very well versed in the Western. I did not read, with the very, very large exception of Cormac McCarthy, I am not a reader of the Western. I'm not like, Louis L'Amour is coming to mind. I was not a reader of the Western. I did not take in a lot of Western movies. But when you have a genre like the Western, and there are different things that have called this an alt-Western, or they've called it an anti-Western, you have this idea of a genre that Enrigue is both like working within and also pushing against. And that also feels kind of messy in the best of ways. And that brings me to a very important part, the notion of the Western. So in 2018, I listened to a bunch of interviews that were done, not a bunch. I listened to actually one interview from 2018, which if you're on the YouTube, I'll put the source up there. But this was it was in Spanish. This is when the Spanish version came out. And in the very beginning, the interviewer asks Enrique that question that lots of people ask, which is like, what would you say if I said, like, what is this book about? And predictably, and I think very like justifiably, Enrique does this kind of thing where he's like the text itself explains what it's about. Like I can't distill it. And that can be a very cagey answer that a lot of authors will give. But in this case, I actually think it's a fair answer because sure, it's about Geronimo, but it's really not just about Geronimo. And it's not just about Camila and Geronimo. It's not about the abduction of a Mexican woman and the existence of an Apache warrior. It's about a huge amount more. So that answer in 2018 felt justified to me. Also like a little coy, but I'm also like, why ask someone that question? Like, what is your book about? He also, in a later interview from 2026, I would imagine, maybe 2025, he was talking about how one of his editors at some point asked him if he could help with like the synopsis on the back cover of the book. And he was basically like, I I can't really help you with that. What I think you should do is just like get the whole entire book printed up in teeny, teeny, tiny type and just like put the whole entire book on the back, because that is the only way that I will be able to like give a representation of what the book is about. So this is someone who's not like going to give us an easy answer about like what his book is about. But what's interesting to me is that in a couple of different interviews in 2026, he has talked about this book as a book about resistance, which is a very different kind of like tune than he was singing in 2018. I love this. So when he is talking about resistance, he is first and foremost talking about the Apache nation. He's talking about Geronimo and this idea of how one culture can resist, whether they're resisting assimilation, whether they're resisting, like annihilation, genocide, whatever it is they're resisting. But what is happening is that people are asking Enrique how this book speaks to the present moment. And yes, there is, I'm recording this on the 13th of March. There is so much happening in the world in terms of just, I can't even begin to like list all of the things, but there's just an enormous amount of political conflict and warfare. And everywhere you turn, it seems like something really dark and nefarious is happening in this world. And a lot of it has to do with national identity. A lot of it has to do with migration. A lot of it has to do with like what are the privileges and what are the difficulties that are put upon you simply because you are part of a nation. All of these are very big questions. But first and foremost, this question of how do we resist tyranny, or how do we resist the threat of genocide, or how do we resist the fate of like our families being splintered apart. So Enrique, I think, is doing a very good job of really focusing on the material and not making this into a big political thing. But I was deeply moved by the idea that in 2018, he was giving kind of a literary answer about how it's difficult to distill a 450-page text into, a little cute synopsis. Whereas now he really is truly recognizing that the idea of resistance, whether it is Camila, who is making her own decisions about how she is going to resist and with whom she is going to align herself and with whom she wants to exist, or whether it is a question of Geronimo, or whether it is a question of these different soldiers who have different allegiances to different aspects of the government, or whether they're operating on their own via their own moral compass, or whether they are simply doing what everyone else is telling them what to do. It's a book that has resistance kind of at every turn. And I think it's actually really beautiful and very moving and very enriching to think about this as a novel of resistance. So before we dive into the different ways that I was like sucked right into this material and the ways that I think the novel both succeeds, mostly I think it succeeds beautifully. There are a couple of different ways that I think it falls a tiny bit short. But I wanted to read some of these synopses that other people put together, mostly critics, because it's very interesting to see how other people are kind of boiling the thing down. So the first one we're looking at is it's from The Atlantic, and the title is A Western That Goes Where McCarthy Wouldn't, which I love that. And then the subtitle is Álvaro Enrigue's Now I Surrender scraps the simplistic binary of cowboys and Indians in favor of a wild, multifaceted war story. This is by a woman named Carolina Miranda. And then this is what she says. The resulting novel about this vanquished country, Apacheria, is slightly unclassifiable. I'd start by describing it as a darkly comic revisionist Western for the age of autofiction, which I love that. So part of what I love there, of course, is the mention of autofiction. Autofiction simply being fiction that it's either like, you can think of it as very like novelistic memoir, or as a novel that has a lot of like true elements in it. And then in the Times Literary Supplement, they call it this: an impassioned anti-imperialist lament, a gripping alt-Western, a meditation on human freedom, an auto-fictional travelogue, and, on occasion, the reading equivalent of a slow-moving trudge across an inhospitable landscape. So as you can see, the Times Literary Supplement, I think this is probably where the guy was like, it's a long book and sometimes feels longer. And I agree that there were, I'm going to dive right into this. I agree that there are parts that I was like, I am for sure going to be skimming a lot of this. And then I was shocked at how little I ended up feeling like I wanted to skim. So I want to talk a little bit about the surprise element, about how drawn in I was by this genre, this idea of the Western, that just didn't, it just didn't really capture me. So the first thing that really truly drew me in was this question of Camila. So you have this woman who is this strong person. She is independent right from the start. We like her. We have sympathy for her. She is, like kind of married in this very dowry kind of political kind of economical way to this much older man that she doesn't love. But we're very interested in her. She's a school teacher. She is widely read. For anyone who's like diving into the 450-page, very dense alt-Western auto-fiction anti-imperialist book, this is someone who is definitely going to appeal to most of that audience. But what I really liked too was the way that we saw her way of life. Like this is, this is 1836. This is in Janos, which is a part of Chihuahua in Mexico. It's a world that I know very little about. And certainly like that moment in history in a country that's not familiar to me, it was a very incisive and detailed and interesting look at what life was like. I also really loved the fact that we understand in some ways the way that she was constrained. So when Enrique is providing us with Camila, this is a woman who is about to be abducted, and we have a sense of that even just from the jacket copy. In many ways, we needed to not love her life so much in Mexico that we were like, wait, how could she be taken away from this? And how can we be convinced that she wouldn't be dying to get back to that? Part of that is that she's married to this much older man. It's a marriage of convenience or economy. It is not, she's not in love with the person that she's married to. She does not have children, which is hugely important. I think if she had children, it would have been much more complicated for her to simply move away. I mean, that's a little bit, I'm making some assumptions there about how a woman would feel about having children. But very smartly, Enrique is providing us with someone who she's not going to suffer that conflict. Like, do I stay with my captors or in this world that allows me more freedom and recognizes me as being like a more significant member of society than this other kind of former existence. I also really liked the way that we had the family move in from Baltimore. They were so odd. Like part of me was like, oh, it's actually, I'm kind of applauding the way that this woman is they're doing like a family bed thing, which was something we did. Like all the kids are sleeping in with the adults or whatever. Like they're like, they seem like a very kind of close family. In some ways it felt like kind of a modern take. And the woman is like cooking her own food and doing these things that to me, like in the 21st century, I was like, oh, those seem like kind of reasonable things for her to be doing. It's different than what's happening. And of course, everyone in the culture is like, oh, she's going to be the enemy of everyone because she's not like, no one has a job anymore because she's like all these people who are employees no longer have a role in the ranch. So we have this setup, like right at the beginning, I was drawn in by a bunch of different elements, whether they felt very like different or whether they felt very familiar. All of it was really intriguing and really did suck me right in. And my reaction to Camila, the way that I was sort of drawn in by her, is very predictable. What is less predictable is the ways that I was drawn in by Lieutenant Zuloaga. And I think it's really interesting to look at what it is that was working so well for me in this part that is about, a group of Mexicans who are going to go after like these cattle, like the group of Apaches has come in and taken some cattle and with them, this woman Camila. But this is a group of people who are banding together to go off and do this thing that's just inherently not very interesting to me. And the way that Enrique pulls this off is so impressive. I also think that looking at this kind of small microcosm of how he makes Zuloaga interesting to me tells you a lot about how he's making all of this interesting to a wide swath of readers. So the first is that when we have Zuloaga, we also have Elvira, who is this nun who actually is a zarzuela dancer. She's like she's like an entertainer, not to say sex worker, but she's like in this monk. Wow, she's in like a nun's habit. She has like this cape. She is like a very good shot. She is someone who's really defying expectations. And she's also like a woman, any woman reading the book who is going to sort of feel some allegiance or some sort of interest in Camila is also going to be really interested in this band of men who are getting together because in fact there is a woman among them. We also have the gemelos, we have these twins, and those would be kind of less inherently interesting to me, except they are charming and they're interesting and they're unusual. And all of them, this whole like band of people who are getting together, really succeed because of a bunch of things that I really think that Enrique is doing right. One of them is simply the level of detail. I mean, like I can picture exactly the way that the jail that the twins were in, the Yaqui twins, they're like in this kind of subterranean jail thing. Like I can picture it so clearly because he did such a good job of like drawing it for us. So you have this incredible amount of detail that it's not overworking. It doesn't feel, I mean, again, sometimes the book felt kind of long, but it did not feel long to me in these things where we were getting a lot of detail about scene. Sometimes it felt long to me. Sometimes I have to say, I mean, this was an area where I did a tiny bit of skimming. Like sometimes when they were like tracking the guys and it was like a lot of detail about their day to day, kind of like trying to find Camila, a little bit of that. I didn't like skip it entirely, but I was definitely skimming a little bit. But I was very invested in these characters. So one of the ways that happens is because of this incredible level of detail. We also have so much humor. This is a book, I mean, all of Enrigue is very funny. Like they're just pieces of it that are, like he's so good. It's a humor that is unexpected. It's dry. It's subtle. It's like often kind of broad, but also very witty and interesting and intricate. I really, really love the humor. And I think that's an aspect that actually does get kind of overlooked. I also was just so impressed with this shocking amount of character development. So we have these people like Zuluaga. I don't even know why I have this, but I have this like so much sympathy for him. Like he's someone that, especially at the end when he's with Camila, and I'm like, oh my God, I love this guy. Like this guy has really like been through a lot, and I really want things to work out for him. And I just had so much sympathy, which is so interesting because he's not someone that I could easily relate to, and not someone who I would have even thought that I would have much sympathy for, and yet you feel very deeply. And the way that Enrique is developing these characters, it's not belabored, it's not a lot of telling, it has everything to do with what they, their actions, and the next point that I'm going to make, which is dialogue. There is incredible dialogue, and it works very hard toward this idea of character development, the way that these people are speaking, the way that they say, like the conversations that they're having, but also simply, their tone or their register that they're speaking in. And all of them have different kind of idiosyncratic, like speech patterns. The dialogue is so, so good. I found some of it really like anachronistic in ways that I loved. A bunch of it felt kind of modern to my ear. And this is a good point to say that I have both the Spanish version and the English version. I didn't read very much of the book, of the English book, but I was listening to it on Audible. So I had some English for sure in my ear, but mostly when I'm discussing this, I'm discussing the Spanish text. But the dialogue is so good. And the last thing I'll say about like how he made like these kind of unlikely elements, meaning like there are these elements that I was not likely to like be really drawn in by them, is all of these different elements. I'll just go through them quickly. The level of detail, the humor, the incredible character development, the dialogue, and all of that together provides this crazy intimacy. So again, this is something that's happening in Chihuahua, in Mexico, in like a very for me, for someone who is existing in the 21st century in California and as a woman, this is not a landscape that I know well. It's not a culture that I know well. And yet we have, because of all of these elements and because of the way he works so well, all of this feels very immediate to me. It's, 200 years ago, and yet I can relate to all of these people, it's incredibly well done. So I was surprised by how drawn in I was by all of these different, elements. Like, and again, like Zuluaga was someone that I really like. He's coming straight to mind. But there are lots of different characters that I felt like kind of deeply invested in these very unlikely ways. But then beyond the idea of the scenes that are very well painted and that are very clear and immediate and well drawn and detailed, we also have these other aspects. One of them is the idea of research. So when we see our narrator, who I think, again, we are invited to conflate with Enrique himself, when we see him, this is someone who's doing a lot of research. This is someone who's describing, finding these maps where a pacharia is like a land, like a zone that is in one map and then is extinguished in the next. We see him in reading rooms. We see him in various different libraries. We see him, honestly, we see him reading and reading and reading a lot. This is someone who's doing a huge amount of research. And what that does, it could be so boring, but it is not boring. And when we have those visions, every one of them is working hard. Like, it is not a mistake that the idea of this map that had a pacharia on it and then like suddenly didn't have it on it. And also just the fact that of those maps, like if you have Sonora, you have a zone that is a Mexican zone and then is going to suddenly become Arizona. Like you have this idea of these shifting landscapes. And on some level, it seems like a long time ago, but 200 years ago, ago, it's not a long time ago. Like, this stuff is happening practically within the last, is it? I mean, I'm trying to think of when all of these states actually became states. I'm not going to be able to answer that right now. But you have the sense of these things as being relatively recent compared to the lives of the native peoples who had been there for millennia before any of the Spanish Empire made their move, not to mention, Mexicans or French or Americans. So we have someone who's doing a lot of research, and that adds to what we are seeing in the book, but it also does a very important thing where we have a lot of trust in this narrator, because this is someone who has a lot of credibility. Like, this is someone who is working hard, and every time we're imagining this person in some obscure library, you're like, wow, okay, this guy came by these things honestly. And it's important because a lot of the middle chunk of this book is these kind of like source materials. And it's, a lot of them he is very clearly like adapting to his own needs, but you do get the sense that he has come by these things honestly. He also does this amazing thing where I literally, there was a thing about horses, and just as I was wondering, like, because he was talking about the origins of the Apache Nation. And as he is talking about them coming down, I was like, wait, at what point are they actually riding on horses? And literally at that moment, he has like this long, it's not even long, it's like a very concise like history of the domestication of horses. So we have these strands that are like these philosophical, sort of metaphysical things happening. We have history, we have like natural history. We have this idea of, like, he's talking about like the Ice Age and the Bronze Age and the Neolithic Age, which I mean, as I'm rattling this off, I don't even know if that's in order. This is not my area of expertise, but you certainly feel like you're in the hands of an expert. And I loved that. I loved the idea about how horses, like the importance of the horse to all of this stuff, and having that underpinning, it makes it feel like a much broader canvas, and it makes it feel much more kind of like dense and heavy in the sense that we really can trust this person because they're building it on this like very brainy and very well researched and very well founded kind of world, and everything that's sitting on top of that, which are these beautiful scenes that feel so immediate and so character driven. All of that feels very well earned. Okay, I want to dive into the text now. We're going to take a very quick look at the title, the dedication, the epigraphs, and just like broadly kind of what the structure looks like. And then we're going to dive in and take a look at the narrator. So in terms of title, anyone who is here at the Fox page because you want to become like a better reader and get more out of what you are reading, the piece of advice is always to simply slow down and pay attention. Often paying attention to a title can be very rewarding. If you stop and think about it, sometimes there'll be a lot of like metaphorical stuff you can take away. At a minimum, it's interesting to think about how it focuses our attention. So one of the things that I like best in sort of having thought through this book is this idea of resistance. So the title obviously is talking about the end, like it's talking about someone who is giving themselves up. It's the end of resistance. But by talking about the end point of resistance, there's some nice metaphysical things in this book too about you never know when things begin. It's hard to know when they end, but it's much clearer to know when they end. I mean, it's this question of certainly when we're talking about nationhood or when we're talking about heroics or we're talking about, and I mean that in the sense of like someone who has a large heroics in the sense of like someone having a large impact on a world, which Geronimo definitely falls into that category. When we have a title that's speaking to the end of something, we're then meant, I believe, to look at the whole thing as a whole and to sort of think about what it means as a trajectory. So I like the title fine. It's not a title that I love. It's I really loved You Dreamed of Empires. That to me really like brought me in because it was so intriguing. This one, I don't know, I wasn't quite as drawn in by it. Muerte Súbita I also really liked. I think the title is fine. Interestingly, I'm holding up my Spanish copy here. I like the title. I like the emphasis here on I mean, for anyone who is on the podcast, the Spanish title, the Spanish cover art is showing it's a likeness, I believe, of Geronimo, although it doesn't really look like the photographs. It might be like another, Apache warrior. But the actual like image itself, the portrait is made of like dirt It's like a photograph of like dirt that's kind of on a surface that's being shaped into like this image of this person. And I like the idea of the dirt as speaking to like the land that this person would have been so like innately involved in, but also the idea that this is so easily blown away. Like if you just like blew on this surface, it looks like all of this dirt would scatter and you would no longer have the image of this person. So we're speaking to the frailty of not only this person, but of their land. So I do like this cover art and I like this title. I'm less happy in some ways about the American title. It is now the title is Now I Surrender. What is important here, when Enrique has talked about the two different titles, like Ahora me rindo y eso es todo, he talked very specifically about how the second part of that clause, y eso es todo, is so heartbreaking. Like Now I Surrender could be this kind of like, now I surrender. Like it could be like almost like kind of like a victorious kind of thing. But like Now I Surrender and that is all is so sad. It's like this ultimate. I guess Geronimo did surrender several different times, but this is someone who it feels a little more broken and a little more heartbreaking at this point. And so I think you do lose that nuance. Now I Surrender, it's just kind of less, it has less meaning and less kind of meat to it in the American version. And now I'm just kind of like shitting on the American version. The cover of the American, the English translation, I do not love. It's on kind of like what looks like a paper bag kind of. Wow, that's maybe not fair. It's on kind of like tan paper. And we have the idea of a sunrise, and it's kind of splintered underneath it in a way that I'm like, is this a sun rising over water? And is that like is this like the light on the water that's kind of splintering like that? And then I was like, what horizon are we talking about? Why am I getting a sense of water from the front? It's a little hard to read. Like the sun itself is this bright kind of reddish color, and then the Now I Surrender and Álvaro Enrigue is in like lighter orange, and I just was like, I'm not really taken. I'm not so taken by it. Happily, it is a book that is getting a lot of attention anyway, and it deserves a lot of attention. And Enrique did say at some point that the reason why they didn't have the subtitle, Y eso es todo, the reason why they didn't have that in the English version is because it didn't work with the design. And I actually heard that before I saw the cover, and I was like, this is the design that we sacrificed the title for? Which, I mean, all of this may be unfair, and I apologize to whoever is like designing this whole thing. But for me, it was not as successful a cover as I would have liked. I don't really know how Enrique feels. Hopefully he feels really great about the covers. I'm frankly kind of medium. Okay, so now that we've talked about the covers and my, my light dissatisfaction with them, I want to open the book. So what we have at the very beginning here is a dedication. In the Spanish version, it says, a Valeria, Maya, Dylan, y Miguel. Interestingly, in the American copy, I keep saying the American, in the English translation, we do not have for Valeria. We only have for Maya, Dylan, and Miguel. Understandable. He and Luiselli have broken up. He is now married, I believe, to another person. But it's interesting to me. I mean, this is a book that documents a road trip that he took with Luiselli. Again, this is a book that he wrote and published in 2018. So for him, this is a very, very long time ago. There are all these charming things during interviews where somebody will read a little clip to him and they'll be like, so what were you thinking about or whatever? And he'll be like, first of all, I think I was a better writer back then than I am now, which is kind of coy and kind of cute. But he has a lot of stuff about like, wow, like that was so long ago, which I do think it's helpful to understand that this is a book that predates what he has been doing recently. It's something that is very much a piece of the past. But so we have this slight difference. The new version is not, in fact, dedicated to his ex-wife, which seems appropriate. But what's interesting to me is in the English version, we have the names changed. So in the Spanish version, the names of the kids stay intact, which is, it's one of these elements of autofiction that I actually really like, because what it is saying to me is like, you are invited as a reader to read our author as the narrator. So when he's moving through and he's referring to the children in the book, the narrator is referring to the children in the book, and they have the same names as the author's children, who we know what their names are because of the dedication. You're really invited to make that leap. In the American version, the names are changed. In some ways, it feels very significant from an autofiction way, but also it's interesting because of the importance of names. This is a book where our author / narrator is talking quite a bit about how important names are. I also was so I was tripping out about the way that we call this person Geronimo, and that is a name that has gotten to be so much a part of the American fabric. There's that weird thing where I think Air Force people, I think that's kind of where it first started during the Second World War. When they were jumping out of their airplanes, they would yell Geronimo. It's so much a part of our American kind of fantasy world. I don't know exactly, that's not a great way to say it, but it's part of our kind of fables. And what I forgot / did not know is that Geronimo it's a version of Jerome. There's Saint Jerome, who I just looked this up. He was born in 420, before the Common Era, I think, or maybe after the Common Era, in the Common Era, but he in Bethlehem. So this is a very important Saint Jerome, and what we have is a version of that. I mean, Geronimo, I'm imagining that's a Mexican, that's a Spanish version. Wikipedia just said that it's Italian. And I wonder, again, Geronimo Goyacla, which is his Apache name, that is someone, he became a Mexican citizen. The Mexican Republic was you now are automatically a Mexican citizen because you exist in Chihuahua. And then we give him this name, which is this kind of Mexicanized name, and then we adopt it as Americans. I think it is so weird when we have someone whose name, we can for sure pronounce Goyacla. It's not that hard to say Goyacla. And then we are calling him Geronimo, which, I just always think it's weird. I think it's weird. Why can't we just say, Moctezuma? Why do we have to say Montezuma? Why do we make that change? I think we're moving away from that. And sometimes I guess it's warranted. I don't know. I just think it's odd. But so the idea of names are very important. One of the points that he makes, we have these 3 children in the book, and one of the points that Enrigue is very clear about, and I loved this, is this idea of having a child, a brother or a sister, who was missing, who was kind of not part of the family unit. And part of that's just because I think biographically that was what was happening in their lives. So it was an easy, thing to kind of play on. But the importance of it, and what he said, it was so beautifully written, so beautifully stated that I wanted to read it verbatim, which is, we lose things when we behave in a politically irresponsible way. So what he means there is that because he has a different identity, and meaning a nationality, because he has chosen to live in a place that is far away from his son. One of the reviews was talking about the semi-estrangement of the son, and I didn't quite get that. But you do have a sense of distance between the two of them. At one point, the boy Cruz, this is in the American version, you get the sense that the father figure is kind of oh, I wish I saw you more. And the boy says, you're the one who lives in a foreign country, which is it's so succinct and it's so beautifully stated. And it speaks to just geographical distance, and the idea also of what you lose when you have divorce and you have children, but also this idea of foreign countries, of just really having a very different existence. So I'm interested in the dedication shifting, mostly insofar as it helps us think about the importance of names. I imagine that Enrique also was probably trying to protect his kids are now older. So if they're teenagers or in their early 20s or whatever, he's not wanting to tell their stories for them, and is wanting to give them a little more distance, I would imagine. So we have our dedication, and then we move on to the epigraph. And the epigraph is by someone named Jose Revueltas, who was an important Mexican philosopher and author from the 20th century. And what it says is, esa gigantesca derrota de la libertad a manos de la geometría. So you have to think this through a tiny bit. The idea of geometry as being really threatening to liberty has to do with, or freedom, has to do with this idea of at least in my mind, it has to do with these arbitrary kind of and to be clear, I did not do a lot of research on this epigraph. But for me, it has to do with this idea of maps. It has to do with the idea of territory. It has to do with the idea of order and of people wanting to, governments wanting to impose order. It really does come down to where you're going to draw certain lines, which is such an odd way to think about how someone is truly going to live their lives, whether they have, again, the responsibilities and privileges of a certain kind of nationhood. Interestingly, with reference to geometry, Enrique has also said that he writes in vectors, and this is one of the reasons why this first-person narrator was important, because you had this kind of vector, this idea of this family on this road trip. And you can see other vectors that you would have, either the way that Camila is moving, from this her Mexican identity with this Mexican family toward a life with this Apache leader. That is a very good segue into just a very brief discussion of the three parts of the book. So we have this Janos, 1836, which is really, that's kind of as far back as we go. And that has to do with the story of Camila and Mangas Coloradas, and also of Zuluaga. So she is taken by the Apache group. And we have Zuluaga and his band of like misfits, kind of, who are in pursuit of them. Importantly, Zuluaga was like an actual Mexican lieutenant. I don't know if he was a lieutenant, but he was an actual kind of military person. We then move on to the second section, which is called Album. And this is roughly from the years 1849 to 1886. We're following the Apache conflict, the Apache wars with the United States, but also with Mexico. So in this section, this is when we are kind of doing the most like historical chunks of things. But it is so interesting because you still have all of these different characters. You have the through line of the family who's going on the road trip. You also have the story of Camila and Zuluaga, but you have, it's interspersed in all of this different history. You end up in that section Album with this idea of this kind of kaleidoscopic vision. And I love the subtitle Album because it really does feel like a scrapbook, not like a scrapbook, but it feels like, you have all of these different sections that are, some of them again feel like historical textbook kind of stuff. And then you have some metaphysical stuff and some philosophical stuff. And you have all of these different time eras, and all of it is kind of mixing together. The last section is called Aria. And at one point, Enrique was talking about how, like, when everyone else is watching prestige television, that he really loves opera. And I have to say that I depart with Enrique there. I am not like an opera person. So, I mean, I know enough about opera to know that the aria is kind of like the culmination. It's like the big emotional kind of resonant, like, the big thing, the big number. And what he talked about is how he wanted everyone, like the aria was going to be when everyone was on the stage and everyone is going to be singing like at their most loud capacity, and also that the orchestra would really be playing kind of at full volume. So I like this idea. It was helpful to hear him talk about it, but you already got the sense, because of the way, honestly, in some ways, because of the way it's formatted, you get the sense of everyone, all of these voices in this polyphonic novel, all of these voices as coming together. And we're going to talk about that at the end, when I am going to actually spoil a couple of things. And I mean, the ending was so satisfying, the way that it was all tied up. And I think you could maybe miss it. I think you might be able to like not really understand how beautifully it's tied up. So I'm going to give you at the end my sense of like, I mean, it's not like earth shattering. I think if you've read carefully, you'll know what is going on and who these different players are. But it's really very beautifully kind of wound up in this end, in this aria. So one of the things that I want to do today is do this thing that always just is so fascinating and rewarding to me, which is to go back and look at the beginning of a work once we have finished it. And this is, it's an interesting book to do this with because there's so many different strands. Like, do I pick out, a part that is describing Camila being like abducted and how like violent and brutal and deeply affecting that writing is? Or do I pick out a strand that's a little bit more, metaphysical and a little more auto-fiction-y? That is, in fact, what I did. Partially because I think it's interesting to look at what, in the very beginning, what it is that Enrique is setting out for himself as the task of the day. So on page 12 of my English version, we have this. The idea is to write a book about a country that still exists, but that was erased from the maps. A country that worked just as well or badly as any other country, and that was taken away from us like cassette tapes or incandescent light bulbs. Where Sonora, Chihuahua, Arizona, and New Mexico meet today was an Atlantis, an in-between country. And straddling it were the Mexicans and the gringos, like two children, eyes shut, their backs to each other, while the Apaches scuttled back and forth between their legs, not sure where to go, with strangers bubbling up everywhere, filling their lands. I'm realizing as I'm reading that's actually something that gets excerpted quite a bit. And it's not a metaphor that works super well for me. It's like I like what it's saying. For some reason, the scale of it is problematic, and I don't like it. I don't like that. Like, it's good that we're children, the Gringos and the Mexicans, and we're like back to back, and we're having this kind of like blind and yucky skirmish. But the fact that the Apaches are like smaller in scale and they're kind of scuttling around, like I don't like the way that it minimizes the Apaches. I also don't like the way that the metaphor gets a little bit mixed when he's talking about all these people bubbling up. There was something about this metaphor that doesn't work quite as well for me as other aspects of the book. But what I love is the clarity with which he is explaining to us like what the point of this is. And we're having this told, we have the metaphor here, but we're having it told to us from all of these different angles, which you could argue would get kind of repetitive and tiresome, but I did not feel like that. So a little further down on page 13, we have this. When the Chiricahua, the most determined of the Apache nations, had no choice but to become part of either Mexico or the United States, they chose a third, completely unexpected path, to fight until the end. I will move to Canada, the Gringos always claim, but they never do. I'd rather die, say the Mexicans, but then we all go on and accept the new state of things anyway. It's so interesting here because we're talking about, the way that people, when they are threatened by anything, and this is a very 21st century threat here, that all of these people who are disgusted with the way things are in the United States and who are wanting to move to Canada, and yet we just kind of keep moving. The point being, of course, is that the Apaches are not going to do that they're going to take a third route. The Apaches said they weren't interested in integrating when the conquistadors made contact with them in 1610, and they kept on saying no until the most celebrated band of Chiricahua warriors fit into the single train car that carried the last 27 of them out of Arizona. I don't know whether there's anything to be learned from such a decision, but I find it so unsettling that I'm writing a book about it. I make a living by writing novels, articles, and scripts based on what I read to support my family, so that my genetic material, my language, my way of being will live on a little longer. But if I were a Chiricahua, I'd do nothing but read, and we would die of whatever people die of when they don't participate in the carnival of productivity: malnutrition, 60 cigarettes a day, no dental care, treatable illnesses, unpaid taxes, miseducation. At the moment of their defeat, the Chiricahua Apaches wrote only in the symbols of death. They left messages along the road, spelled out in an alphabet of cadavers, so that no one would forget to whom this country belonged, or to whom it had once belonged. This country that Mexicans and Gringos felt the right to occupy. The country had no name, not at first. So one thing I love so much about this, and this is an incredible thing, because when you have this idea of like the Americans saying that they would always move to Canada and the Mexican people being like, I will not do this anymore, like I'm out. That is an addition that is made in the English version. And I think, this is this idea of resistance. And it's speaking, in fact, to a resistance that the American people who are always like, oh my God, everything here is so awful that I'm going to move to Canada, and then no one moves to Canada. It's this idea of like, I will not stand for this, and yet I'm just going to keep going on. You could, I guess, like say that that's an act of resistance, but in many ways it also just feels like an act of inertia. And I did not do a ton of analysis of the translation in comparison with the original version. But this is one of these additions that I think are so strong. And Enrique has talked a lot about Wimmer and how he's very involved in these things, and how he really sees the idea of a new translation as being able to like improve and to add to the book in ways that are meaningful. I love those two additions. Of course, the most important part here is that for the Apache people, they're doing something that's very difficult that none of the rest of us are doing, which is really standing strong and truly resisting, and not like just letting inertia kind of move them forward. So importantly, this voice that we're hearing at the very beginning, this first-person narrator, this is a voice that we hear throughout the whole entire thing. And I think to sort of differing degrees of success. There's one part where he is in Berlin and he's watching these young boys a few of whom are migrants who have come from different countries as far as their ethnicity would allow him to know. I found that, to me, it felt a little far afield. I was like, why are we talking about these boys in Germany? And it didn't, there were a couple of times where this present day narrator didn't mix in quite as well. Once the family was underway, I felt like then it was much more kind of like organically woven into what was happening in the actual, in the backstory, meaning in the 19th century. There were also a couple of times where I would see something in the past and in the present that was woven together in a way that had a lot of resonance but was very subtle. For example, like when the family is going into Graceland and you have this question of Elvis, and then also the fact that in the backstory, the nun, the zarzuela dancer who is with Zuloaga, that person is also named Elvis. So every once in a while you would have this kind of resonance between the front and backstory that felt like it was kind of organic. And that worked very well for me, but there were not a lot of examples like that. So we have the consistency of this first-person narrator, but one of the things that's most important to me is the way that not only do we have that through line, but we have these different strands that truly are being woven together. And this is where we're going to have some spoilers, perhaps, if you have not really thought through this piece of it. And I'm hoping this is obvious to most people, but it's so remarkably well done, which is that when we have Camila and she is being abducted and she is gone through this brutal time, which we're going to talk about that in 1 second. The way that she most clearly is experiencing healing is that with this young boy named Goyakla. So we have this young Apache man who is who really is nurturing her, and he is teaching her how to speak Apache. And they have this, over the period of what feels like a couple of months, she is healing physically, but also is coming to learn kind of the Apache way of life. And so as that is happening throughout this strand, we then have the introduction of all of this historical stuff, and we have the through line of the family who is on the road trip with the writer. And in each of these sections, when we have Zuloaga and we have Camila in the Jano section in the very beginning, they're very clearly kind of they're blocks of text that are separated. And certainly when we have the different historical texts in Album, when we have that kind of like scrapbook kind of thing, you have different typographical things happening, and when they're telegraphs, they look a different way, and all of these are separate blocks of text. What happens in Aria that is so beautiful, and you will have missed this if you only listened to this book on Audible, is that all of those strands, you still have some space breaks, but all of the stories start melding together in the sense that you have them all, instead of being separate blocks of text, you have all of those different stories in like the same chunk of text. I'm not explaining this like in a super technical kind of way, but it is such a beautiful way that Enrigue is trying to show us the way that these strands are being woven together. And in some ways, you could argue that the present day family is a little bit less germane. But the reason why I just mentioned the fact that they went and saw Geronimo's grave at Fort Sill is because this is a family whose pilgrimage really is to see Geronimo. So the modern day family is very deeply tied to the idea of Geronimo. Then of course the whole Album section in the middle is also deeply involved with this question of Geronimo. The whole story, the whole entire book. We know this from the title, our focus is meant to be on Geronimo. And certainly the Album part with all of the different political people and all of the different warring factions, all of that has to do with Geronimo as well. Everyone is trying to find him or to capture him or to kill him. And he is proving elusive. His God told him he would not, in fact, ever die. So he is totally cannot be killed in battle, which is such an interesting strain of the whole thing. But so in the center section, we have this real preoccupation with Geronimo. What we don't realize until the end, and I loved this so much, and I loved the ending of it so much, is we have Zuloaga finally in conversation with Camila. This is a union that I had been waiting for the whole entire time. We get the sense that Zuloaga in some ways is intrigued by this woman. He's maybe carrying a bit of a torch for her. And you're kind of what is going to happen here? Is Zuloaga going to get there and somehow it's going to turn into a romance and Camila is going to fall in love with Zuloaga and they're going to ride off in the sunset? You don't really have a lot of faith that that's going to happen, but it's a possibility. But what happens instead is we have this incredibly warm, not incredibly warm, but Camila is very supportive in insofar as she can without having him like killed instantly by all of the Apaches who are surrounding her. But you have this real kind of, you get a sense that she has some faith in who he is and why he is there. And the whole point of him being there is that he's like there to kind of like rescue her, when in fact she does not at all want to be rescued. So as we are in the end of the book and we're finally seeing Zuloaga and Camila come together, the one of the main things that we understand, and that's still obviously happening in the 19th century, one of the main things we're understanding here is that the young boy Goyakla, who has been like her mentor, is also Geronimo. So this is that thing that happens with the name, where Goyakla, when we're meeting him in the 19th century, and he is together with Camila, and he is this young man, and Zuloaga arrives, and Goyakla is a young man still. So in the very end of the book, during the aria, we have Goyakla as a young man, but we also come to understand that he is also Geronimo. It's so beautiful. And it's like the whole thing should be so unwieldy. And in many ways, a lot of it is. It feels kind of unwieldy, but it feels unwieldy in a good sense, in a sense that this is messy and all of this stuff is difficult to pin down. And everyone has their own version of the story, and everyone has their different priorities, and everyone has their different aims. It's just a beautiful way of like kind of like rendering the messiness of this situation. But I loved the fact that along with this, like the through line of the story of the family, we also have the through line of the story of Geronimo. So essentially we're learning about his childhood through Camila and Zuloaga in a way that is unexpected, and that when we find out in the end the way that it all comes together, it is so satisfying. So before we go on to take a quick look at this one other aspect, and then we look at the close of the novel, I want to talk briefly about this idea of Camila and like the brutal nature of the experience that we have and her trajectory. So part of me, like the violence that she endures is so awful and so humiliating and so just like incredible that part of me is like, I don't think I'm gonna buy it. Like I don't understand how I'm gonna like come back from this. And in some ways, I'm not totally sure it was earned. Like part of me is like, this is too brutal. And like, why would this woman ever like come to love this man? But I think there are a couple of things that Enrique has put into place that are helpful in this regard. I'm not, for me, I'm not sure that it was completely convincing. I don't feel like it was totally earned, but there were some good ways that he shaped this that kind of helped me to see why it is that she would in fact be in love with Mangas Coloradas. So one is that she's not in love with her like husband, who's like the old Mexican guy. Like there never was anybody that she was truly in love with. We don't have anyone competing, for her heart here. We also very clearly see when she's kind of displaced by this family who comes from Baltimore. Clearly, to be clear, the family who is in Baltimore it's a Mexican family. It's a group of Mexican people, the sons of Camila's husband. So one branch of the family, of a Mexican family, has been up in Baltimore learning about agriculture. And when they come down, Camila is both displaced. Suddenly she doesn't really have a role anymore. But we also realize that women in this moment really don't have anything, like the role for women here is very small. In fact, some of the ways that the woman who is coming from Baltimore, I think she is a white woman, when she comes in and she's doing like a lot of mothering and she's doing cooking and she's like setting up house and it's uncomfortable for everyone in the household because they don't know what their roles are anymore. And when I say they, I mean the people who are employed by the household, they resent her because they don't have a job anymore. But at least like she has stuff that the mother figure has stuff that she is doing. So you do get a sense of the very limited existence of a woman in this time period, in this point in history, and in this geography. I think you can argue too that there's this kind of like dark night of the soul thing happening, which is when you go through something that is so harrowing and violent and awful that you have a sort of a rebirth. So she goes through this. I think she, like everyone else, was killed back at the ranch. Back at the ranch. It's like one of these tropes that came from the Westerns. But this idea of like, everyone else was killed, so she was allowed to survive. So I guess maybe that's part of the reason why she's like, falling for her captor. But also you have this sense of having been through this suffering, so that when someone alleviates the suffering, then you would be somehow grateful to that person. Enrique himself has talked about the fact that in many ways, this kind of really brutal violence that she experienced, he would like that to be seen as balanced with a kind of empowerment. And it is true that when young Goyakla is teaching her words in Apache and she is having responsibility and she's learning how to live in the way of the Apache people, that she does have more responsibility. What's most helpful for me in terms of like really buying the fact that she is in love with this leader, with Mangas Coloradas, who is a very important like warrior in the Apache community. You get the sense when she's talking to Zuloaga, so this is at the very end, she's talking about how handsome he is. She's talking about how hot he is, which like meaning like how sexually attracted she is to him. And she's not like belaboring this stuff, but you're like, oh, okay. Like there's an element to this that we did not see before that we now see, like there's like a very physical attraction for the two of them. You also find out that and this is a story that was like this story that had been circulating about Mangas Coloradas, that he fell in love with a Mexican woman and was so in love with her that he like kicked out his existing wives, who are very, very powerful people in the Apache world. He got rid of them in order to have this wife with him. So we have, and we do see that in like these scenes. We see, well, it's Camila recounting the scenes to us, but you have this sense of him as having really prized her and having really valued her, Mangas Coloradas, having really valued Camila enough that he's willing to sacrifice these other people in order to have her be, the love of his life. So I think in the end, I was very happy to like give myself over to this idea that Camila really was in love with Mangas Coloradas. And I think that Enrique earned it. But part of me was still like, I don't know. It was so brutal. I mean, right now it's occurring to me like, did it need to be that brutal? Probably because it needed to be accurate in terms of how people were treated, which in the time of these, skirmishes is the word that was used in, I think it was Wikipedia, which is obviously really understating. In these incredibly brutal conflicts between these groups of people, the violence was just like crazy. So I think that there's a balance here, and I think Enrique has done a good job of tipping us toward being in favor and kind of believing the idea that Camila would be in love and also would be empowered to a certain extent by her captor and by this new way of life. And honestly, maybe like the most kind of compelling idea about this is something that he talked about in the interviews. I don't know that probably it's in the book too. It's a little hard for me to remember like what I read in the two books and I heard on the audio version versus what I heard in interviews. But one thing that he said that's very compelling is that whenever you would have like a child, whether that was an American child or a Mexican child, when they were taken away by the Apaches and raised by the Apaches, if they were given the chance to come back to like their American counterpoints or their Mexican counterpoints, they always wanted to stay with the Apaches. So again, this is one of these like researched like historical facts upon which he is building. And I think that like knowing those facts is also very compelling. So I want to look at one aspect of the book that I found so compelling. So in the aria, when we are moving toward the final close of the book, we have this repetition of this idea of and that is all. So the idea of y eso es todo. So in what we have here are different moments when Enrique is saying, and that is all, about something other than just Geronimo's. Like Geronimo's words were, I'm paraphrasing here, I used to move like the wind, but now I surrender to you, and that is all. So Enrique is taking this phrase. It's from the title in the Spanish version, which I think is much more forceful. But we know in the English version that is what he has said. He was quoted. So we do that phrase like y eso es todo, and that is all. We know that in both versions, but it's more clear in the Spanish version. What I love is the way that then one of the things that Enrique is weaving is this phrase, and he's weaving it into these other contexts that really speak to resistance, but also speak to like a lack of resistance. So I want to look, it's on page 345 of the English version. This is in the second part, the album part, and it's a section called Insomnia. First came the Europeans screwing over the Indians, then the children of the Europeans screwing over one another to name things with borrowed words. And that is all, America, whatever you call yourself. Love this idea of "and that is all," which is this refrain that pulls us back to the idea of whether someone is resisting or not, in fact, resisting. It's also just a beautiful example of how all of this is being woven together in this very organic way. That is a very good segue into the close of the book. I love the ending of this so much. So one of the things that's happening at the very end here is we are seeing Geronimo, and he is literally in a cage. It's this terrible moment, and it just makes you feel like kind of sick as an American, and you know that he's just about to be fucked by like all of these lies, and like everything is about to really go badly for him. But we are seeing him as someone who is incredibly human, and he's a father. So very much like our narrator, he is someone who's kind of a family man. He is, in fact, at least the way it's positioned here is that he has agreed to go to Florida. He's agreed to surrender because he wants to stay with his family. So we see him as this family man, and in fact, he is enjoying the presence of this baby, who is a baby of a couple of Americans who are there, like gawking at him, but they're prominent, and so they bring their baby forward, and he's enjoying the presence of this baby. So Geronimo clearly is like our real focus here, but what is happening also, we have him enjoying this redheaded baby, but we also have the children of our narrator, and they have said to him, they were upset because their older brother has left and their family is divided, which is, I really don't think that we should say that like the division of Enrique's family is like what's happening with Geronimo's family. But you have this idea of he said it himself that we lose things when we behave politically irresponsibly. Obviously, Geronimo has much, much more to lose, but you have the idea of families being separated versus families that are still united together. So the young children who are sad their older brother is gone, they say, we want to stop at the border of Colorado, and we're going to, because we have a plan, unbeknownst to the parents. So we have this beautiful ending on 452 in the English version. We begin here with the children of Enrigue. They burst out of the car, shoving each other and tussling like the two puppies they still are in happy moments. I watched as they planted their feet firmly on the ground and counted to 3, giving each other looks of perfect complicity. They raised their hands to their mouths and shouted in unison at the top of their lungs with the ear-splitting force that jolts us awake at night. There are still Apaches, Nana, and we remember your name. Then we have a new paragraph. Then Geronimo took a few steps away, holding the red-headed baby even tighter. He whispered in the baby's ear, surely in his own tongue. The children shouted, there are still Apaches, Cochise, and we remember your name. He might have been telling the baby he had powers, the Apaches had powers, and he could help him find his own. Maybe he whispered that his son Chapo was here, but soon he would see Lena, Azul's child. She was still little, captive in Florida, and he had surrendered because he didn't want her to suffer there fatherless. There are still Apaches, Mangas, my children shouted, and we remember your name. He might have been telling the baby how the white eyes put children in jail. They still do and no longer feel any shame, and that if the baby came with him, he could be a little Apache, even though he had red hair. There are still Apaches, Geronimo, and your name will not be forgotten. He might have been telling the baby how when he was a young man, he'd had other children, but the Mexicans had killed them and his first wife in an unholy massacre, a shame to be borne forever by those of us who carry the green passport with an eagle on the front. One of them was an infant when they shot him, his body blown to pieces where he was left lying on the ground. Or he might have told the baby that his life was just beginning as the Chiricahuas were leaving, and it was a pity he had been born too late. The land would endure, but the world had ended. So beautiful. I'm not gonna do any real analysis there, except to say that I just think this is this haunting idea. His children are saying the name Geronimo. We are seeing this image of Geronimo, and we are seeing the end of a world. It's so beautifully rendered. And I have to say that for someone who would not naturally have been drawn to this, Enrique has done just like this incredible job of making me care really deeply And not only that, but to see like really become invested in the plight of, I mean, it's much more than a plight. It's like in the genocide, to be really witnessing the genocide of a people, and to feel it as a story of resistance, and to really think about what it means to sacrifice, and to sacrifice family, and to not sacrifice family, and to resist. It's an absolutely beautiful meditation on a lot of different things. But I love where we come at the end. I love the idea of ending with Geronimo, but also the idea of this world ending. It's haunting and elegiac and just gorgeous. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to hope that today's talk has given you an even better sense of why this new work by Enrigue is really so multi-textured and polyphonic in all of the most beautiful ways, and why it's just such a moving and deeply affecting piece of literature. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.